frontiers of the empire for fresh victims. In a particularly galling incident, reported by Herodian, Caracalla appears to have accepted a peace offering from the Parthian king, and then went even further by agreeing to marry the king's daughter in order to secure a lasting friendship between the two great empires. Caracalla and his entourage then crossed the Euphrates and marched overland to an agreed-to meeting place where the couple would be wed. The Parthians had no reason to suspect treachery, and arrived ready to celebrate a marriage that would have profound and hopefully happy political implications. But Caracalla had never had any intention of marrying the foreign princess, and when the two families got together, Caracalla ordered his men to slaughter the Parthian wedding party and burn the city to the ground. The Parthian king managed to escape with his life, but everyone else was killed in the surprise attack. Caracalla then marched back across Mesopotamia, looting and burning the countryside on his way back to Syria. Then he fired off a dispatch to the Senate, announcing that the entire Parthian Empire now bowed at his feet. This was a bit of an overstatement to begin with, but beyond that, Caracalla neglected the whole part about his own murderous duplicity. Oh yeah, they should feel free to call him Parthicus from now on, though. Next week, a life of chilling sadism will finally catch up to Caracalla. He was simply too dangerous to too many people to not have one of them finally decide to knock him off. In the end, it will prove to be one of his Praetorian prefects, a man named Marcus Opellius Macrinus, who will turn to murder after finding himself in the rather uncomfortable position of having a soothsayer prophesize that he is destined to wear the purple one day. Since prophecies like that were liable to get a man killed, Macrinus will quickly decide to beat Caracalla to the punch. And the funny thing about it is that in trying to steer clear of the deadly implications of this prophecy, Macrinus would make it all come true. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 103, The Equestrian. Caracalla had donned the purple in early 211 AD, at the age of 23, and from that moment on, he dedicated himself to the task of being a brutal, unforgiving, and moody tyrant towards everyone except his soldiers. He was as bad as they come, and I think the only reason we don't put him down as the worst emperor of all time is that, for one, he wasn't really terrible things he did were merely exaggerated extensions of what his father had already done. He didn't have the time or the imagination to take a healthy empire and really wreck it the way that, say, Commodus had done, which is what it takes if you want to be considered the worst of the worst. I don't see Caracalla's reign, then, representing a turning point in the history of Rome, but I do see it as representing a breaking point. His time on the throne became a sort of malevolent high watermark that future emperors alternatively tried to dial back from or ratchet back up to, depending on their dispositions. Caracalla, in his enrichment of the soldiers and his scorning of all other men, inadvertently set a standard that everyone would point to down the road as either a cautionary tale or as a shining beacon of light. Things can never again be like they were under Caracalla. Things must go back to the way they were under Caracalla. The former argued by the old men of the Senate, the latter by the hard men of the army. This running argument was a major current in the tension that would define the coming crisis years. When put succinctly, the argument sounds like this: is the army the tool of the state, or is the state the tool of the army? Caracalla, for his part, probably was not acting from any deeply thought-out political philosophy, nor probably did he care a whit that future generations would fight over his legacy. He just wanted to enrich the soldiers and scorn all other men. Like I say, no imagination at all. But before we get to the business of bringing a violent and ignoble end to a man who deserved just that, we should swing back and briefly touch on three things. The first trivial, the second architecturally interesting, and the last fairly momentous. First, I can't believe I didn't mention this before, but yeah, how did Caracalla get his name? As I said in episode 100, he was known as Lucius Septimius Bassianus until his father became emperor, at which point his name was changed to Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Caesar. His contemporaries, including the historians Cassius Dio and Herodian, generally shorthanded this to simply Antoninus. The name Caracalla, not really used in his lifetime, and really not used in his presence, was a nickname that referred to a particular type of Gallic cloak that the emperor habitually wore. As the years passed, it became easier to label him with that distinctive cognomen rather than Antoninus, which was a name practically every emperor adopted so as to associate their reign with that now clearly past golden age. The same sort of thing happened with Caligula, who was referred to in his own time simply as the Emperor Gaius. The second thing, the architecturally interesting thing, are the Baths of Caracalla, which the emperor ordered built in 212 and which were completed in 216. This massive, massive complex in the southeast of Rome was one of the last great construction projects of Roman antiquity. Before too long, Constantine will drag the imperial capital to Byzantium, and Rome itself will fall on hard times. Even in Italy, the dominant imperial cities will become Milan and Ravenna, depending on the decade, leading to a general disinclination in spending money to gussy up a city past its prime. The complex, which sprawled over 33 acres, was by far the greatest and most ambitious bathhouse in bathhouse-crazy Rome, and more than any of its predecessors, was a full recreational facility. Sports rooms, baths of all kinds, grottos, libraries, gardens, the works. The thing was, and its ruins still are, quite a sight to behold. It cost a pretty penny, and no doubt displaced a lot of residents and businesses, but I think we can be pretty sure that that wasn't of any interest at all to Caracalla. One of the other last great building projects in ancient Rome, the Baths of Diocletian in the northeast of the city, copied profusely from the design of Caracalla's baths, which at that point had been operating for 50 years. Both baths continued to operate well after the nominal fall of the Western Empire. The last thing, the momentous thing, was that in 212, shortly after becoming emperor in his own right, Caracalla extended citizenship to every free man in the empire. Slaves were still slaves and women were still women, but by the stroke of a pen, or maybe the hammering of a chisel, every free man within the borders of the empire became a citizen of Rome. What had once been a valued prize, a prize so valuable that wars had been fought over who could have it and who couldn't, was now as common as the beggar in the street. But before you start getting the wrong idea, no, Caracalla did not issue his Edict of Universal Citizenship because he was feeling the moral tug of equal justice or something like that. No, as Gibbon says, by the time Caracalla issued the order, Roman citizenship was far more a burden than it was a privilege. Universal citizenship increased the tax base. Period. End of story. But even though it was now more of a burden than it was a privilege, that did not mean that citizenship did not still come with privileges. However base and immediate his motivations had been, Caracalla's edict was a landmark moment in the history of Rome and the history of Western civilization. In an instant, one of the greatest legal distinctions of all time was blown to pieces. They were all Romans now. Well, except for the women and the slaves, but they don't count. When Caracalla left Rome in 213 AD to travel the empire and become the common enemy of mankind, it was the last time the people of Rome would ever see him. He was still in the east in 217, taking a victory lap after his triumph over the Parthians, when he met that violent and ignoble end I was just talking about. As I mentioned in passing last week, Caracalla posed too great a danger to too many men to not have one of them get desperate enough to attempt assassination. Not that I am in any way advocating a determinist reading of history, but the life and times of Caracalla just scream when he'll get assassinated, not if he'll get assassinated. The when finally came when an oracle in North Africa started blabbing to anyone who would listen that Marcus Opellius Macrinus, one of Caracalla's praetorians. Everyone knew that prophecies like that were extremely dangerous, even during the reign of a relatively mild prince. But to have it floating around during the reign of a violent paranoid like Caracalla, well, that was basically a death sentence. The prophet in question was rounded up and brought to Rome for questioning, and the praetorians tried everything to get him to recant. Threats, bribery, torture, but the oracle stuck to his story. Eventually, the Praetorian officers in charge of the investigation were obliged to send a report off to the emperor, who was traveling around Syria with the imperial court in tow. At this point, the invisible Hand of Destiny, also known by its more common name, the Lucky Break, stepped in, giving Macrinus a chance to save his own skin. The report in question arrived with a bundle of other business, and Caracalla, never much for mundane governance, handed the entire untouched bundle to the good prefect Macrinus, with instructions for him to take care of the trivial matters and brief him if, by some miracle, there was actually something interesting in there. Macrinus retired to his quarters and began working through the dispatches when he came across a particular report from the Praetorians back in Rome. I can only imagine that Macrinus muttered a fair share of curses under his breath as he read what the oracle refused to unsay. At a minimum, those few brief sentences were going to cost Macrinus his long and successful career. More likely, though, they were going to cost him his life. Macrinus had been born in modern Algeria around 165 AD, and, like Septimius Severus, was the son of an equite. But unlike Severus, he did not have influential uncles in Rome, and so he was never recommended for senatorial status. As a result of his status, he never held any of the traditional posts up-and-coming Roman politicians usually hold, and never held any position of authority in the legions. But he nonetheless distinguished himself as an able administrator and routinely secured important posts within the imperial bureaucracy during the reign of Septimius Severus. As you probably noticed, there were essentially two paths to public prominence in the Roman Empire. One was to be a great soldier, which Macrinus was not. The other was to be a great lawyer, which Macrinus, over the years, established that he most assuredly was. It was on the strength of his prowess as a jurist, then, rather than on the strength of his prowess as a fighter, that Caracalla named him Praetorian Prefect shortly after becoming emperor. The appointment of a civilian to what was essentially a military post was not uncommon at all, and in fact, emperors, the good ones anyway, liked to represent both paths to prominence in their choice of prefects. One old military hand to keep the troops in line, and one capable bureaucrat to handle all the administrative work that had accrued around the guard over the years. Whether or not Macrinus was aiming this whole time to become emperor himself one day is unknown, but I would have to say that it's pretty doubtful. Over the years, prefects had aspired to be emperor in all but name, but their equestrian status, the very thing that qualified them to be prefect, disqualified them from being emperor. Sejanus had made probably the most concerted effort to get around this by marrying into the Julio-Claudian family, but most other ambitious prefects simply considered that final step a bridge too far, and were content to wield power behind the throne. The empire had seen Italian emperors, and then Spanish emperors, and then even